When I was 16 years old, I moved from a neighborhood that wasn't so great to one where all the rich kids live. My mom is disabled, so we found an apartment complex specifically for that reason, where all the countertops and shelves were low enough for her to reach. I made many friends, and for once, I felt like I had everything I needed. One night, me and a friend headed over to a neighbor's house. She was telling me that she believed that this area was built on ancient Indian burial grounds because she would see people walk past her door late at night, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone came and rang her doorbell. I brushed off the story and didn't think anything of it until one night I was in my room and heard someone outside my window talking. I had no curtains on my windows, by the way, just blinds. So I ran straight to my mom's room and told her, and she told me that it was just my imagination and to go back in there. So I did. Not even 5 minutes later, I hear the voice again. So I grabbed my friend, my field hockey stick, and a softball bat, and was ready to face whatever or whoever it was. But no one was there. After that night, I only slept in the living room. So for weeks on end, I believed that there were ghosts haunting this place, until one day I came home from school and my mom says that visitors are coming over to talk about my ghosts. I was extremely confused until 2 policemen showed up asking me about what I had heard. I tell them exactly what happened, and they say, "Well, the workers here found a cinder block and a stool behind a tree right by your window, and the grass by your window is completely dead." When I asked them to show me, I was immediately sick to my stomach that someone had been watching me. And when I moved into the living room, he moved too. I cried and just felt disgusting that this had happened. They put cameras out, and they were able to see the description of the man and the fact that he brought a dog with him. The dog saw the cameras right away. For the longest time, I couldn't sleep in my room, and I was so relieved that he knew that we had cameras out, so he wouldn't be coming around anymore. Until last year, me and a friend of mine were just driving around and causing havoc like teenagers do. When we pulled into my apartment complex, I saw a man with the exact same description as my peeping Tom. I automatically tensed up, and my friend even said that she wasn't getting a good vibe from it. When we parked, we noticed that he went around my apartment building, and that as soon as he walked by us, he pulled his hood over his face. I never found out who it was or anything else after that point, but it still creeps me out to this day. When this encounter happened, I was only 10 years old, and my older sister was 12. Our father passed away when we were very young, and to this day, our mother never remarried. During our childhood, our mother would go out on dates with men that she had met, but they never would amount to anything more. One Friday night, she went out and left us at home. She would always leave right after we went to sleep. The doors stayed locked, but this time I guess it just slipped her mind on the way out. Anyways, the living room connected to the hall that the bedrooms were on. My room was the second bedroom down the hall, with my sister's being the third. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of the door opening. I figured it was my mom coming in from her date, so I rolled back over and tried to go back to sleep. A few minutes later, I hear the door shut again, and a few seconds after that, my sister comes into my room terrified. She told me that when she woke up, she saw a man standing in the doorway, staring at her. He was wearing a long black trench coat. He never said anything, and when he realized that she was staring back at him, he turned and walked out. I grabbed my baseball bat from my closet and crept out into the living room. The door was wide open. By this time, my sister had called my mom, and she had called the police. When the police arrived, they searched for fingerprints but found nothing. The scariest thing was that nothing was taken from the house. He came in, but didn't take anything. We stayed with our grandmother that night, and the following night. The next day, the police returned to look for more evidence. My mother did notice that one of our chairs was missing from the back patio. It was found in the woods behind our house, on the top of a little hill. This man had taken our chair, sat up there, and watched us. How long had he been doing that? Apparently, there had been 2 other similar break-ins in the neighborhood. He would come in and not take anything, and all the people were single mothers. What would have happened to my mom if she had been home that night? A few weeks later, this hermit guy that lived down the road was found dead from an overdose. I don't know why, but my mom seemed to think that he was the one that was watching us. But there hasn't been any break-ins in the neighborhood since. This happened when I was 21, living in a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate. It was the summer, and I had my bedroom window open with the curtains covering the screen. It was around midnight, and I was in bed watching a movie. I started to hear some noises from outside. This wasn't alarming. My apartment complex was pretty noisy, and my window was right by a walkway to one of the parking lots. The noises sounded like footsteps, which made sense because there was a walkway nearby. But they sounded a little close. I tried to ignore it, but that's when I heard someone talking. I was thinking that it was just someone talking on their cell phone, and that it's fine and I should go to sleep. The voice sounded way too close, as if it was right by my window. Then I heard someone clearly say,
"I want to fuck you. I want to see you naked."
I sat up and looked to the window and saw a shadowed outline of a person. I flipped my shit and screamed and ran into my sleeping roommate's bedroom. I was in a tank top and underwear, and I gave no fucks. I tried explaining to her what happened, and she didn't believe me at first. She kept saying that I might have heard someone talking on his phone, and I kept insisting that the person was looking in my window. I filed a police report, but since the curtains covered his face, I cannot describe the guy. The next day, we told the apartment manager, and he said, "Oh yeah, that guy. That's why we install motion lights around the walkways. He comes here every once in a while and likes to peep into people's windows and talk dirty." He went on to say that the guy has even been beaten up several times by boyfriends and husbands, and still comes back. Our manager gave a description of the peeping Tom. The part that stuck out the most was that he was described as being very meek-mannered and shy. A detective called me, wanting more information about the incident, specifically if I got a good look at the guy, and could pick him out in a lineup. I didn't see his face, just a shadow, so I had to say no. It was so frustrating to know that everyone knew that this was the guy, but there was nothing that I could do. Several months later, I was walking from the parking lot to my apartment. When I came around a corner, I saw a man walking very slowly in front of me. I had a bad feeling. This guy was walking so slow, almost shuffling his feet. His head was dropped down low, and his eyes were glued to the ground. He heard me round the corner and stopped. He then shuffled over to a wall, and it's hard to explain, but he leaned his face into the wall as if he was trying to hide. As he waited for me to pass, I knew instantly it was him. I walked past him and kept turning my head to check on him. He hit against the wall until I was about 20 yards away, and then I watched him slip along the wall into a little dark alley, lined with bedroom windows.
I thought I would share some of my experiences from living in a haunted house. I lived there for 14 years, just moving out of it last September. I'll start with the disclaimer that I was not a believer. I always thought ghosts were fascinating, but I never looked for them blindly. Most of my early experiences I tried to find real explanations for. Honestly, this house had countless things happen, but I'll just relay some of the bigger ones. It was a townhouse, and the floor plan was living area upstairs, bedroom downstairs. You entered the house on the top floor. My first night sleeping there, my bedroom was under the living room. I heard footsteps walking across the living room all night long, to the extent that I grabbed my framing hammer a few times and snuck up there, convinced that someone had broken in. This happened repeatedly for years, and I convinced myself that it was noise traveling through shared floor beams with neighboring units. Although it still happened often, even when the unit that I shared a wall with was vacant for 18 months. There were also a lot of odd times when doors would crack open slightly and close. Several times this happened when my mom's dog was over. He would walk towards a door, it would open for him. We would walk through it, and it would literally close behind him. When he would come to leave the room, the door would let him out again. Very weird. At some point, my now wife moved in, and it escalated. One night, I woke up in bed and saw an opaque figure sitting up in our bed, initially thinking that it was my wife sitting upright and looking out the window. When I asked what she was doing and she didn't reply, and went to shake her shoulder, my hand just went through nothing. I then realized that she was asleep on the pillow, and whatever was standing there had just vanished. I jumped out of the bed and looked everywhere for an answer. Nothing could be found. I told her about it months later, and she said, "Oh God, I have seen so many strange things here, and I didn't want to tell you because you would have thought I was crazy." There was a lot of little things. She would yell for me from upstairs because she swore that she just saw me walk past the kitchen doorway, etc. Often things would move from where we put them. Once near Christmas, we left the house and came back to the lights being turned on, that we know weren't turned on, and ornaments on our tree having been rearranged. We got a break at some point for a while, and when we were in bed one night, bedroom door closed, we made a joke about how our ghost hadn't been active for a bit. And as soon as we said it, the bedroom door started shaking hard in place. Final share, and the one that people seem to think is the creepiest. When our daughter was born, we would shush her to nap with the 3 shush method, rocking her in our arms, saying shh, 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 over and over. Well, I had put her down, and I ran to the hardware store. My wife called and said, "I thought you were at the hardware store," and I said, "Yeah, I am now." She paused and yelled, "Get home now." I ran back. It was a 3-minute drive, and my wife was holding our daughter. She said that after I left, our daughter started fussing, and over the baby monitor she heard the shh, shh, shh. And she got confused because she hadn't seen me go back downstairs, not realizing I was already down the hill when the noises started. One last one, daughter related. When she got a few years older, maybe 3 or 4, she would cry at night, and one night I went in and asked her what was wrong. She said that she was scared of the shadows. I showed her that the shadows were just light tricks, and I did a shadow puppet. And she said, "I'm not scared of those shadows. I'm scared of the scary shadows that come sometimes." That honestly freaked me out a little. Again, there were tons of other incidents, but these are sort of a greatest hits. People have asked me why I stayed in the house for so long, and as funny as it sounds to some, it was never scary. There was no feeling of malevolence or harm. In fact, I always thought the shushing of my baby story was more of a "wow, this ghost is nurturing" kind of thing. Or maybe even my dad coming back to visit. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed my spooky stories. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went camping in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people that I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted one another. We had been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized that we had bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we had changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. It was the kind of place with hookups for RVs, picnic tables, it had fire pits and grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or another house. There may have been a few other small groups, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes, followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet away off the trail. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were really freaked and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but this was long before any of us had ever experimented with any mind-altering substance. Regardless, I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth, and then walked back together in complete silence. When we got to the spot that I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was still there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed really scared. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what occurred. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. So who's to say? My first visit to this hospital was in 2018. After searching for the address for a while, I came across one that looked accurate enough and went on my way to that lost place with a friend of mine. We arrived, astonished by the size of the complex. I didn't do a lot of research before that. I just knew that it used to be a hospital and was built during World War II, and by the address, it seemed legit. On our way down from the parking lot to the lost place, our excitement was growing, but so was our anxiety for reasons that we just couldn't ascertain. We make our way onto the complex at the part where the main entrance was before, and the air felt really dense. My friend felt the same way, but we brushed it off as just being a bit nervous, just ourselves, and we started to walk past some buildings at the entrance, completely focused and being amazed. At some point, my pulse must have slowed down due to me being focused on trying to take in everything I was seeing, because I noticed that it increased in speed when we reached the buildings where I suspected that the patients would have been. It felt like there was strong electricity in the air that made me feel even more uneasy. That's when we heard a door slam behind us at one of the buildings. We, of course, completely froze. The sound came from a building that was pretty far away from us, and that sound was very loud. There was no wind at all that could have caused the heavy doors to slam like that. The trees weren't moving, nor did we hear anything else. Just one door that decided to slam shut on its own. We nervously chuckled and decided to move closer to the exit. I asked my friend if I should record this visit on my phone, and she agreed. We both turned on airplane mode and went on our way. Whether it was due to our anxiety, or us being too alert, or something actually being there, we would turn around or stop walking at the same time, asking the other if we had heard that sound. Sometimes the sounds behind us resembled soft footsteps. Other times we would hear silent whispers that we couldn't quite make out. At some point I began to question my sanity, but I knew that there had to be something there to make such specific noises, loud enough that my friend would also hear them, as I did. As we were walking toward the actual exit, we stopped to look at one building and we heard a very, very loud bang behind us, making our walking become very determined as we made our way to the main street. The bang was accompanied by other sounds that we couldn't define back then. Fast forward and both of us are at my place. We grab individual headphones and start to listen to the recording. And boy, was that some weird stuff. We both enabled plane mode before I hit the record button, but there were so many disturbances in the recording, distinct sounds like someone coughing, whispers, with clear vowels, that we couldn't quite make out the full words to. A woman's voice going, shh, breathing, and bleeps. I have to admit that we were freaking out a lot. I was almost crying because I found it to be so chilling. The thing that baffled us the most was the loud bang that made us leave. I swear to you, it wasn't there. At all. Not the bang on the recording that startled us so much that made us leave the place, but silent sounds? You can hear us being startled and agreeing to leave immediately, but no bang could be heard on that recording, and it's still not there. I held my phone the exact same way that I had been since I started that recording. I didn't put my clothes against one mic. The mics weren't broken after a test recording that we did. So there should be a banging sound, but absolutely there is not. And I have no clue why that is the case. That hospital is a really special place. From later experiences there, I have come to possible conclusions as to what kind of paranormal things occur. This is the only time I have ever had a threatening contact or experience. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided to go with our girlfriends on a camping trip. It's the day of, and we're packing all of our things into the car. We finally get everything loaded and get into the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin to unload. After getting my stuff, I begin to gather my girlfriend's things. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for a one-night camping trip. She smiled and opened one of them, which contained an ounce of pot and other paraphernalia. The other 2 bags had her favorite snacks and clothes. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near any other people. It took until sundown, but we discovered the perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke. We started to build a campfire to light the area so that we could set up our tents, but ran out of wood immediately. I said that I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes I find some sticks to use. I start picking them up, and all of a sudden I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a very pale, strange-looking man wearing a blank expression. For a man, he also had surprisingly long fingernails. He was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help, and my friends shouted a response, saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned and ran as fast as I could, horrified. I met up with my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I just wanted gone. We loaded back up and took the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags into it. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist right after, but my iPhone broke and my cloud wasn't backed up, so I lost it. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since then become a scar, which shows just how much force he was using. It was absolutely terrifying. In June of 2016, my mother died of cancer. 5 of my 6 siblings and I were fortunate enough to make the trip to the small town of Harper, Texas, to be with her in her final days. If you've ever been to Harper or have driven through, you know that there's not much to it. With a population just shy of 1,100 people, 1 restaurant, and 1 stoplight, it could be more accurately described as a rest stop along US Highway 290. To keep my sanity during the trip, rather than stay in my mother's tiny and now very overcrowded house, I opted to stay at a hotel in nearby Fredericksburg, about 25 miles away. For the next 2 weeks, I made the drive daily to spend time with my family, making the most of that time that we had left with our mother. One by one, my siblings and I eventually had to return to our normal lives, although 1 brother and sister would stay with our mother until she passed. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, leaving my mother and knowing full well that I would not get to see her again in this plane of existence. I had a very early morning check-in time for my car rental and flight back to California. Since I would need to get up at 3 a.m. to drive the 85 miles to San Antonio, I felt it prudent to get back to my hotel in Fredericksburg and try to get some sleep before departure. Sleep did not come easily. Although I was tired and emotionally drained, it was still very early in the evening. After what seemed like an eternity of tossing and turning, I finally managed to doze off and slept for a few hours, until it happened. I awoke suddenly and opened my eyes wide, but did not try to move from the position in which I lay. I felt an unmistakable presence with me in the room, like someone had been standing in front of my bed and watching me. I slowly peeled back the comforter from my head, and still trying not to move, mustered whatever courage I had at that moment, and looked. At the foot of the bed, I saw a dark silhouette appearing to just stand there. Considering my emotional state at that moment, I quite literally said out loud, "Oh hell no," and just pulled the comforter back over my head, knowing the next time I looked, whatever it was I thought I saw standing there would be gone. What happened next was one of those moments that stay with you for a lifetime. As I lay there with my head covered, I held my breath momentarily and just listened. Seconds later, I felt someone sitting down on the foot of the bed. I could feel the bed shift slightly, and the weight of the comforter on my legs got significantly heavier. I remember being upright at that moment, throwing the covers off of me and saying, nope, no way." I got out of bed and now paced the floor, trying to both calm and reassure myself that I was in fact the only one in the room. I looked at the clock and saw that it was just after midnight, and then made the obvious choice that I would stay awake for the next few hours before checking out of the hotel and driving to the airport. I opened the mini fridge and found an energy drink, then turned on the TV and texted my wife about what I had just experienced. At 3 a.m., I was at the hotel front desk to check out and settle my bill. The night auditor was a very nice young lady who had greeted me with a smile, commented on my very early departure, and asked if I had gotten enough sleep. I shook my head and proceeded to tell her what had happened to me in my room earlier that night, still a little freaked out. Her expression now more serious, the auditor leaned forward and said in a lowered tone that she knew that the hotel was haunted. In the dead of night, she would hear children running up and down the hall, look, but see no one there. Chairs would slide across the floor in the nearby dining room, making an unmistakable sound she said she heard quite often. I paid my bill, thanked her for sharing her experiences in the haunted hotel, and was soon on the highway driving to the airport, homeward bound. I have experienced many paranormal occurrences at my own home, but never while traveling. If you lived in Canada, then you know that there's a lot of countryside out here, along with forests. Most of the abandoned buildings you might come across are found there. I was 16 when this happened. I grew up mostly in the rougher part of the capital. Yes, even Ottawa has its tough spots, and one is known as Vanier. While it's no Detroit, it's still where most of the poor, along with other drug addicts and homeless, live and stay. I've been through plenty of stuff that a lot of people would say is scary, but this is something that still to this day, at 21 years of age, does not sit well with me. I was with my buddies at a warehouse of sorts. It was pretty deep in the forest. We were drinking and talking when one of my friends brought up the old story of a haunted farm near that spot. He went on about how the guy who got him in brought him there to scare the crap out of him. I want to add that when they went, he did confirm that his friend was the one who was messing with him, but he still said that something was off about it, so we started making jokes. And then I made a joke that got him really serious. I think I said something along the lines of, "There's a ghost in there with Betty White making a porno." He then looks me in the eyes and tells me, "No, something is messed up in there. I don't care what, but I felt it." Me being the jerk that I am, I joked about how he was being a wuss and that the only thing you really have to fear is fear itself. He then convinced me to go to this haunted barn. In retrospect, I should have just shut up right there and then. Next thing I know, we're heading to the barn. We get there, and it's me, my friend, plus this guy that I don't really know, but he was with the group. We walk in, the three of us. Me and the other guy start loudmouthing, right? Wild stuff like, "Hey Casper, what's poppin'?" and "First spirit that comes out gets bopped on sight." I'm not joking when I say that we get halfway in when these heavy doors shut on us. Those big barn doors, the old ones that took some effort getting them open in the first place, let alone having them swing closed like that. We go to push them open only to find out that they were stuck. So we immediately turn to my friend and start grilling him over trying to trip us up over some fake ghost crap, while Random that was with me starts turning on his flashlight on his phone. I'm asking where our mutual friend is, who I thought was helping him, until I noticed my friend is straight tearing up, which causes me to start freaking out. And I mean freaking out. I'm banging on the door, trying to get homeboy to help, while big homie is acting like a statue. I get a weird feeling on my shoulder. I start to freeze up, and all I hear to my side is "scared," as if it were some kind of taunt. I spin around, seeing the same scene as from when I had started freaking. The guy pushing on the door, my friend staring off into nothing. As I'm asking if anyone heard that, the guy pushing the door starts spazzing, saying something in Spanish, I think. I grab him, telling him to calm down, while he's giving me this look like he just got shot. I'm sitting there trying to snap him out of his funk. Then my friend starts ramming into the door over and over really hard. I thought he was going to hurt himself. It was dark. I can't tell exactly what was being thrown around, but I can tell you that a lot was going through the air. We just started hearing crashes from all sides. I even got hit with something. I still have a scar to this day on the left side of my chin and my left shoulder. Then, the screaming. It was like 3 chicks were getting cut up. It was awful. I won't lie, I'm not going to act tougher than I am. I started passing out for the first time, being the most bizarre feeling. My friend grabs me and the random guy, both of us not seeing that he did get the door open. When we got out, I threw up, while the random dude said something that I didn't catch and then just took off. My friend and I looked at each other and started walking back. The entire way he was explaining that he had no part in this. He kept swearing it up and down. I kept ranting about how that this was impossible, and that there was no lock on the door, so how was it even locked? And that caused him to freak out more. I had to go to the doctor to get stitches for whatever it was that flew into me while we were in there. When I told the doctors what happened, which I had to say what happened, but really I should have just made something up, because it could have been anything. And when I told them what did happen, they looked at me as if I were crazy upon my explanation. They actually made me go and see a shrink for a bit, due to my outlandish claims. After a while, they let me off the hook, thinking that I wasn't crazy. All I know is that I was sober that night. Last time I checked, 2 beers don't make you trip out, and random dude is refusing to tell us why he was screaming. Now, for a bit of comparison, when I was 15, I had a shotgun pointed at me and then pressed into my stomach, being threatened that they would pull the trigger. But that's simple. I'm about to get blown up, and that's gun plus angry dude equals body. But that night, I could not explain, nor could I control, or fight back. That night fills me with a terror that has changed my life. And I see how rooms and dark places that I didn't know what was happening or how to react to or defend are the reasons to this day that this was one of the most horrifying experiences I have ever had. Don't get me wrong, getting a gun pointed at me got me on the path where I'm trying to change my life. But I can't change not being able to walk in the dark around my house and my refusal to be in dark rooms. This took place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside of our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body, and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound, was at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out, and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and I that's experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything else that might make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all of that. I explained what had happened. He replied no, and thought that I was just making it up. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite, but couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch, so even if it was a bear, I'm really surprised that it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared shitless I was, seeing this dark object observing our tent. Could it somehow have been the wind? A deer? Who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole trip. The next night we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona. Before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down by the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, in our peripheral vision, we see a giant rock being thrown near us. It makes a huge splash in the water. We look up and don't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and still see no one. We yell out taunts and curse words, but still heard no one running off or any kind of sound in response. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him, right up until that giant one at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought that maybe someone was following behind us, messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said no, that was impossible, that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad that it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night, or the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing more than a memory that we wanted to rationalize. My mom and I both work at a very old, very haunted hotel. We used to be incredibly open about our haunting experiences, but our current owner is a real jerk who refuses to acknowledge any of it, despite the business that it could bring in, so we no longer put it in the brochures or broadcast it in any way. But I guess it makes it all the more convincing when the guests tell us crazy stories, as they usually have no prior knowledge of the hauntings or even the history of this place. Which is a real shame, because the building has had some serious connections to incredible people who played a major part in founding the country. So a few weeks back, we were in the middle of our January lull. Every year during that month, a lot of us get laid off because we're not needed, so it's pretty quiet around here between the lack of both guests and employees. However, this night we did have 2 guests check in, both of whom were local, and they were celebrating a special occasion as the guy had flowers delivered to the room before they checked in. They went to the restaurant to eat dinner, and then went to their room shortly after 9 p.m. At 10:45 p.m., my mom was startled to see them standing at the front desk with their luggage, looking pale and terrified. They were very reluctant to tell my mom what had happened, but said that they wanted to check out now and not wait until morning. My mom has seen this look on guests' faces before and finally coaxed the truth out of the guy. Apparently, they had went to bed a bit after 10 o'clock, and half an hour later they shot awake to a great crash and the sound of glass breaking. They scrambled out of bed and flipped the light switch on, and could not believe what they saw. The massive, heavy glass lamp on the bedside table had been knocked off onto the floor, where it lay in pieces next to the alarm clock, as though someone had just taken their arm and swept the whole lot off in a rage. After seeing this, the couple grabbed their things and bolted from the room. When they were checking out, they were so embarrassed that they didn't even want a refund and refused my mom's offer to move them to another room, even though it would have been a huge upgrade. The woman just kept saying, "I just want to sleep in my own bed tonight." And the guy told my mom, "We may come back one day, but never again during the month of January when the hotel is nearly empty." My mom apologized as best she could for the craziness and checked them out, and she gave them a refund anyway since they had only used the room for a very short while. When they left, she and a coworker immediately went to view the room and found everything just as they described. While they were marveling at the strangeness of it all, a faint sound nearly scared them to death. It was the woman's cell phone vibrating under the sheets, where she had left it in their frenzy to escape. They grabbed the phone and headed back to the front desk, where they were met by the guy asking to come if they had found it. With his wife in the car waiting, he decided to open up a bit more to my mom about the incident, as his wife was already terrified, and he knew it would only make it worse for her. He said that before they fell asleep, he had an undeniable sense of dread, as if something were going to happen. And when the sound first woke him up, he looked toward the foot of the bed and saw the silhouette of his wife standing there. He asked if she was okay, and heard her voice answer right next to him. She was still in the bed. We've had people hear voices in music, see apparitions, and capture incredible images on camera, one of which was a young man dressed in colonial-era clothing, and you can see him clearly down to his hair and belt. But for someone or something to sweep a lamp and clock off of a table so hard that it breaks the lamp is very unusual. Our phenomena is very rarely of the physical variety, so I am not sure what to make of this. I myself have never been frightened of whatever is here, maybe because I'm a history lover and would almost welcome the prospect of seeing someone from such a long-gone era. As to who the woman was that this guy saw at the foot of his bed, I have no clue. We have a very well-known female spirit in the hotel, supposedly from the era when it was a Civil War hospital, but the building also served as an elite college for women and of course was a home when it was first built. It could have been anyone for all we know. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to set up my tent. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, kind of dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear the sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk/drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point, and now it sounds as if the hooves are being really heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along behind it. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing. I mean, not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What on earth? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. There was just crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I did have my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, followed by women's laughter and sticks snapping off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. Then I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all sounding like different people, and confirm that this is real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire off a warning shot into the air in case they come too close. Something about this laughter, how far in the woods that I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night, told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intently to my surroundings. There was no more laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. I relaxed just a bit, and figuring that I had scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering, not very far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle again and listen to what they were saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I call out again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people that were just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise, back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the entire time, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me. I left all my gear in the woods that night. When I was a child, my family often spent the weekends or the holidays at my grandmother's house. As a typical traditional Malay house, the house was made out of wood and was quite huge. Not a surprise, since my father does have a lot of siblings, 9 of them. It wasn't just my immediate family. Most weekends or holidays, even my uncles and aunt would be there too, along with their family. Sometimes there would be around 50 to 70 of us inside that house. It was truly one of my fondest memories, where the entire huge family would sit together to have dinner or celebrate birthdays or whatever. One day, my grandmother fell sick. The doctor simply told us that her health was deteriorating since she was quite old at the time, but that she required no hospitalization. My dad and his siblings all made up their mind that my grandmother should stay with them. Every month, she would stay with a different one of her children at their house. I remember she stayed the most at my house, since it was the biggest at that time. I was happy, since she was a great storyteller and a great cook. In the meantime, my father and uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately, her health continued to decline. She told my father that she wanted to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't like the idea with her being alone in that house, especially with her declining health. After much discussion, my eldest uncle decided to build a house directly in front of my grandmother's house for him to stay in. In the meantime, they would rent a nearby house so that he or my cousins could visit her every day. My father and his siblings also agreed to hire a nanny for my grandmother so that she would never be alone. Fortunately, despite no one having been staying in the house for about 2 years, it was relatively clean. It had been almost a week since my grandmother returned to her own home. The weekend was coming, and my father decided to bring back the tradition of staying at my grandmother's. That Friday night, around 2 of us were there, and that night strange things began to happen. The first to notice that something was off were my cousins. They were all the daughters of Dad's youngest sibling. They were always cheerful, but at that time I remember their faces almost always looking terrified. I chalked it up to them just being kids, which was ironic since I was only around 10 myself at that time. Then, as I walked past their bedroom, I heard through the thin wall that the girls complained to their parents that they had noticed a few shadowy figures, which had been all over the house. My uncle tried to convince them that it was just their imagination. I decided not to care much. I was too tired and sleepy. That night, while I was sleeping, I remember waking up and staring above and seeing something terrifying. Just so you know, a traditional Malay house rarely has a ceiling. The house beam was exposed, and you can see the inside layer of the roof. During my sudden awakening, I saw something like a shadow sitting on the house beam. I had to rub my eyes to see, and after a while I began to make out what it was. It was some sort of creature or something. Am I still dreaming? I thought to myself. I was utterly terrified. I could see the creature, but it was like my brain failed to see exactly how it looked. Sometimes it would look like a lion, then a crocodile, then a huge bird or some other kind of animal. And then it looked at me. All I could remember was its huge red eyes and a wide grin filled with fangs. I tried to scream, but my voice stuck in my throat, and my body felt stiff, as if I were paralyzed. All I could do was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it, and force myself to go back to sleep, hoping that it was a nightmare. The next day, as I sat alone at the stairs, trying to get rid of the memories of what happened, from the corner of my eyes I could sense that someone or something had been peeking out from the toilet area looking at the living room. It appeared to be a child, or was the size of a child, with pale, gray skin. Another time I was sitting in a chair in the living room. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but it happened throughout the day and the night. That same child. Then I heard my aunts talking with each other. It turns out that I wasn't the only one who had noticed it. The entire family had seen it too. Or rather, we could only see it through the corner of our eyes. When we all turned to look at it directly, it disappeared. Some decided to check it out themselves, and yet nothing would ever be there. My uncle quietly told us that when a house was abandoned, there will always be something that will live there. That house had been abandoned for 2 years before, so obviously something had moved in, and we were all simply intruders. He told us that if we didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother us. That night we all prayed together, as well as recited some holy prayers. Yet I could still see the little stalker, and I could begin to notice a few shadows around the house that did not belong to the furniture or to the other people living there. Worse for me was at night. I woke up again, and this time the thing was already grinning at me with what I assumed a hand or finger poking at my cheek. It didn't feel solid at all. It felt more like a cloud of smoke. Again, I tried to scream, but my body felt stiff. Like before, I could only slowly pull my blanket to cover my head and force myself back to sleep. I never dare to sleep at that house ever again. Anytime we ever went back to my grandmother's house, during either weekends or holidays, I simply stayed at my uncle's house that was right in front of it. Yet every time I entered there, I could still sense the small figure poking its head out from the bathroom wall and the shadows that would be moving around. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then we never have had reason to stay at that house. Now, the house was downsized while I was at university, yet it still has the original layout of the lower area. They only actually got rid of the upper area. I asked my father why not simply demolish the entire building. He then told me that even getting rid of the upper area was difficult. Workers were pushed by nothing, and electronics and engines would always malfunction. In the end, they decided not to touch the bottom area and just continue to use it as storage. I spent the weekend camping throughout the Northeast, and all was very normal and quite nice. However, last night I camped in Massachusetts in a wooded area between Providence and Plymouth. Nothing felt negative, but I saw lights at least 3 times. The last time was just minutes ago, and that's what prompted me to write this. The lights are very quick, and almost out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what to say or quite how to describe it. I've never seen anything like it. And if it was paranormal, it was very clear. However, each time, they disappeared the second that I looked directly at them. There are some really, really messed up reasons to live in a haunted house. I, being of sound mind and body, don't know any of them, but I am superstitious as hell. So when the wife and I moved up to New Hampshire, right on the Vermont border, we were looking for a place to rent for a year or 2 before we bought a house. Now, for all of the New Englanders here, my wife is a native. I'm not. She's used to New England and the vast emptiness that this small area has to offer. There are places even she won't let me travel to after a certain hour because, quote-unquote, that route you have to take, people don't come back from it. Of course, I'm not a native, so I have no clue about any of this. So when I would come home late after dark from work and tell her I took X route, she would kind of look at me in shock and awe at my stupidity. We found a home right on the above-mentioned border on the Vermont side. We loved it. It was a fantastic place to live, except for the basement. I could not shake the feeling of being watched and stalked like prey. So, like any reasonable adult, I said screw it and didn't go down there except for during the day. Then one night, after gaming for hours in my loft, I got hungry. I went downstairs, kissed the missus, and walked past my basement door toward my kitchen. I don't know if anyone reading this has gone hunting, but there's a moment when you sometimes experience, especially hunting predators like coyote, wolf, bear, etc. Sometimes they know that you have them in your sight. Sometimes they look toward you, not quite at you, but it feels like they are boring into your soul saying, "You've got me, make it quick." It's an eerie sensation, and sometimes you take the shot, sometimes you don't. On that night, as I was walking past that door downstairs, I saw red eyes and a humanoid figure. I froze, just stopped dead in my tracks. I gave that same look of, "You got me, make it quick." After that momentary lapse of sanity, I just scooted real quickly away from the door, grabbed a weapon, and called my wife, saying that there was someone downstairs and to call the police. There is no other entrance to the basement, and I had the door covered with my weapon from a safe position where I could easily run from the house. The cops showed up, I disarmed, they cleared it out, and they found no person, but a muddy set of footprints that started facing the stairs up, and then proceeded to walk into a hall in the back corner of the basement by the water heater. For some context, the wall in question also blocked off the area directly under my bedroom. It was a solid wall, with a small crawl space and maybe about 4 inches of clearance on the other side of it. The cops called the detectives checked it, couldn't see anyone in it, and they couldn't enter it. Photographs were taken, shoe sizes compared, my feet were too big, my wife's feet too small. We got a good contact number for the detective, and the wife and I stayed at a hotel for a couple nights. For months afterward, I would have the same thing happen. Eventually minus the cops. It actually got relatively normal. Good old Red Eyes in the basement, chilling like a villain. Wife was less enthused by my antics. Cheerfully, just about, and when I would spot Red Eyes, I would always give him a good old, "How you doing?" of which we would still have muddy footprints and I would just have to clean them up. So, COVID hits, the lockdowns happen, and we have an opportunity to move to a better house, one where we'd be able to work at home better. The main reason that the home was better, though, was that we had a mold issue in this house. It was in between the panes of glass in the windows, and every day we were cleaning it from the windowsills, door frames. Hell, we had to replace pieces of furniture multiple times, and we are very clean people. We notified the landlord over multiple months, and eventually a year, and after their actions were not helping at all, we decided to move. The landlord decided to get a housing inspector out there immediately after we left. The inspector came and verified that there was indeed a mold issue. I don't know if they met red eyes. However, they did find a metric ton of readings of high spore counts on the wall bordering the space below my old bedroom. The wall where the footprints always ended. So, since it was filled, the inspector scoops a little bit of the earth on the other side of the wall through that crawl space. It wasn't earth as in dirt. It was approximately 7 feet of mold. The landlord then immediately contacted specialists to remove all of it and notified me to offer some kind of damages for it in the form of refunded partial rent payments. All in all, it made my 2020 pretty good. Until about 3 months later. The landlord calls me and offers to send me a full refund of all rent from the time when I was living there minus what she already gave. Why? There was a corpse. The medical examiner said that it was the man who had owned the property before my landlord. He was a lineman who, after talking to surviving family members, wore a size 8 shoe. Smaller than my size 11 shoes, bigger than my wife's shoes by a mile. It was red eyes. It had to be. I don't know how you got there, but hell, bud. I hope you found peace. Sorry for not checking it out sooner. I did, after reading about his obituary and contacting his family, swing by his final resting place to drop off flowers, place a stone, and share a good morning like I used to. Till better times, red eyes. Back in October, I decided to treat my girlfriend to a night away at a popular British seaside town. The town is one of those historical areas, which has its fair share of ghost legends and gothic tourism, so there was lots of touristy attractions such as ghost walks, which me and my girlfriend decided to go on. A bit of background information about the hotel. It is regarded as one of the oldest hotels in the town and is also a popular tavern among the locals. The inn itself had a rather creepy feel to it, but our room was modern and comfortable. The last place you'd imagine paranormal activity to occur. We set off on the ghost walk with a local guide who knew about the paranormal hotspots. Unexpectedly at the time, we stopped directly outside our hotel. "This is the most haunted hotel in town. Good luck if you're staying here," he cackled. He proceeded to tell us that there was a number of spirits that haunted the building, and guests frequently experienced sightings and unexpected things. However, at the time, we were a bit drunk from dinner, and we brushed off the walk as your typical tourist trap. We went to bed without any issues at all. I woke up later that night, paralyzed, and with a sense of unease. I felt what I would describe as a strong, cold gale blowing around the room. Imagine being outside in strong, windy weather. The sensation lasted for, I would say, about 15 seconds when it suddenly stopped and the room filled with a warm, relaxed sensation once again. I woke my girlfriend to tell her, and she brushed it off, saying it was probably sleep paralysis and a draft. So I believed her and went back to sleep. I thought nothing of it until we checked out. The receptionist asked us how our stay was, and if there had been any issues. "Everything was perfect, but there was a really big draft in the room," I exclaimed, as you would. Surprisingly, she casually laughed. "No, that's not a draft. It's just a spiritual presence in the room. It happens all the time in that one," she casually reassured us. Now I'm really interested in the paranormal, so I asked about the stuff in the hotel. She told us that everything the guy told us on the walk was indeed true, and the spirits are those of old landlords and locals whom help run the hotel and keep the guests safe. She told me lots of stories of how guests would stumble on the stairs and be caught by an unseen presence, as well as children's lost toys showing up right at the moment where they're about to start crying. She even told us that one of the past landlady's spirits acts as a bouncer, causing troublemaking and aggressive guests to feel ill enough to leave. The receptionist seemed really happy and was used to the paranormal activity in the hotel and says that she regularly sleeps alone in the rooms without any worry. Obviously, this isn't that much of a scary ghost story, but more of an interesting experience. I would definitely go back for another stay in that hotel. This story took place during my childhood when I was about 12 years old. A few days ago I thought about it and still don't know exactly what it was and what I should think. It's not the most spectacular story, but anyway. I grew up in an apartment that was pretty outside the city and close to a forest. We had a lot of greenery around, and we were always playing and sometimes also camping outside with friends during the summer. So one night, me and two friends decided to build my tent and sleep outside. We were always then staying up really long and telling ghost stories. While we did this, we suddenly heard noises from outside the tent. We were all holding our breath. Then we could hear steps. They came closer and closer, and then the steps even went around our tent before stopping. We got really scared and said, "Whoever you are, go away or we will call the police." It seemed to work because the steps continued and headed away from our tent. After a minute or so, we then tried to be brave and go outside the tent to see who it might have been. Then, when we looked out, we saw a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, walking away in the dark. I still don't know who or what she was, but it continues to give me chills. On Labor Day of 2015, my mother, my wife, 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we had rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a really bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and decided to take a walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river. We were all barefoot wearing sandals with shorts. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing, throwing rocks, etc., when I realized that there were 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. It turns out we were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, then surely they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my wife and kids were inside with the doors and windows all closed, even though we had opened everything up to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch while they were eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed 3 times with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it, and each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, again, we're hours into the wilderness in Idaho with no sight of a person the entire trip except for them. We decide it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103 degrees, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin to start loading the 2 cars, and that's when we heard 3 adults and what sounded like 4 or 6 large, heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one on the right side of the house, when exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff into the vehicles, which took me about 4 to 5 trips. I had a stick in a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each time and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I finished the loading, I took out each kid individually and loaded them into the cars. Then I escorted out my mom and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason or other, I felt that I needed to close it. I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car by about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now this gate is literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered zero protection or barrier between me and the animals that sounded like they were out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life rumbles through the air. I turned and ran so fast I swear that I must have jumped from where I was to the driver's seat of my car some 30 feet in front of me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. It gets weirder and scarier though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son. We both kept having this horrible, evil doom kind of feeling, like a shadow over us. I looked down and realized that I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we softly hear our son begin to cry. We realize that he's become responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, and was hardly able to even speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said that one of our kids died. I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me, or anyone else, anything more. She lives her life now with a guilt that she willingly ignored her premonition and put us in that situation, nearly taking the life of one of her dearest grandkids away. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this all sounds insane, but a week later on the local news were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears may not coexist in harmony, but they do share territories and tend to respect each other. This outpost station of sorts was 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify that these animals actually exist around there. I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre-early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have half a sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go to the mountains anymore. For some background on the house, it was built around 1650 near Oxford, England. My parents are well off, so it's pretty nice. Big, but not excessive, in a small village, and it's right next to a graveyard. As in, we have an outbuilding, which is an old blacksmith's forge, that literally sits on top of the graveyard, and our garden lowers compared to the graveyard wall because the place is so full of bodies. It was originally one house, then split to 3 with a small cottage, then to 2 houses, and I live in the slightly bigger of them. The house has been a pub, too. We still have a door from when it was. The land dates way back. We have 2 Roman wells on the property, one covered by the patio and one that's full of earth in the garden, which had Roman artifacts surrounding it that had been put there by some old residents. It is really ancient, so it makes sense that it's haunted, right? My family moved in February of 2015. My dad, my mom, my older sister, and me. We had no idea of any of the shit in this house at this point. At first, there were just some weird vibes. We heard some strange noises, some doors closing on their own, but nothing to freak out about. Apart from in the section of the house where no one slept in. Our then spare room in a small upstairs wing of the house. Our printer was kept down there, and whenever my mom sent me to get printouts, I would always sprint away as fast as I could out of fear. I used to cry and protest about going down there because it felt so terrible. There was just a thick air of terror. We actually got the village priest in to bless it about a year later. I went to a Christian school, and my mom thought that it would put me at ease. Instantly, all bad stopped down that side of the house, and my sister suddenly moved rooms down to it, and her old room became our spare room, and instantly got that same thick, heavy air. A few months in, maybe April, my mom had a weird experience of the corner of the duvet being tugged on, and then a creature crawling up her back. It wasn't sleep paralysis, as she had had that before, and she could move. It was heavy, crawling up her back like a person, and it got to her head and disappeared. A lady came round. She heard the house got new owners. She had lived there in the 1970s, and told my mom that she had had the exact same experience of the tugging and the crawling, and also that her piano played itself, among a few other weird experiences, before my mom mentioned anything about what she had experienced, and my mom's heart sank. She didn't tell me anything until a few weeks later when I came to her in tears, saying that I had seen a shape walk into the room and then disappear, and have something tug at the duvet and walk up the front of my body, and that it was definitely not sleep paralysis. That's 3 people having the same experience, give or take how the person is laying, without communicating it. Odd. I can't explain the feeling. By this point, we were all aware of some weird stuff. We found chicken bones in the roof of our cellar, which is way older than the rest of the house, possibly like 1500s. We had doors slamming. We had footsteps. But then, my dad had an experience. He has never believed in ghosts. He's lived in old houses for a long time. He's had family friends have terrible experiences with the paranormal. He grew up Catholic, and he didn't believe anything up until about January of 2016. My mother, sister, and me were all in the kitchen, and he was walking past the spare room and heard shuffling coming from inside. He shouted my mom's name, asking if it were her, and a deep, gravelly voice replied, "Try again." He ran down the stairs, white as a sheet. At this point, it was 2017, everyone had been through something in the house. Shapes would walk by, disembodied footsteps roamed around at night. We had objects moving, watchful eyes on your back, chairs moving, inexplicably cold rooms. Pretty typical things for a haunted house that were happening basically on the reg. Also at this point, I made some new friends and started inviting them around. The spare room had a double bed, so that's where we would have slumber parties. I had several friends ask me, "Hey, did you hear that knocking sound on the walls or the drawers last night?" Every time they came over, all of them left with very similar accounts. I would then relay my stories and watch them turn pale. It was fun for me, probably not for them. I had some friends over again, and we made a point of shutting the door to see if it would open, and it did. We all had trouble sleeping that night. In 2018, I had a German student exchange at school, and my exchange partner slept in the spare room. On the last night of her stay, I had something knock on the slats underneath my bed. It woke me up, but I fell asleep again, and it woke me up again a few minutes later, and knocked while I was awake. I left the room and told whatever it was to get out, and it did. I slept fine for the rest of the night. It did not like that the German girl was in the spare room. Around this time, our next-door neighbors walked up to us one day and asked if we had had our house exorcised because of how terrible things were for them. Heavy footsteps would stomp around their house. They heard the disembodied crying of children and playing their glockenspiel in the middle of the night. They were terrified and presumed that the increased disturbance was because we had had it blessed. We didn't, but at this point the activity did slow. Every now and then from late 2018 to 2020, we had banging and footsteps and touching and noises again, the usual. Nothing that phenomenal, just small, creepy, unexplainable happenings. Lockdown was uneventful, until November of 2020, when we had our kitchen remodeled. The kitchen was kinda remaining from about 30 years ago, so I reckon that it really made the ghosts mad to have it changed. They were mostly fine with us in the house now. They knew us. We had lived there 5 years after all. But our builder they hated. He worked during the day when me and my sister were at school, my dad at work, and my mom, who works from home, would run errands. One day he asked my mom if someone else lived with us. She said no, and asked why, and he said that he had heard footsteps in my room above the kitchen, and doors slamming, and voices and noises during the day that started from the moment that we were all out of the house. He also heard footsteps walk into the kitchen and stand behind him, thinking that it was my mother and striking up the conversation, but realizing that she was out of the house when she didn't reply, and that there was nothing there. Several times he thought someone was there with him, and heard them move and breathe when they weren't. He's a 6'2" burly, muscular firefighter, and he also felt a larger person, bearing in mind everyone in my house is 5'6" to 5'8", and we always hit our heads walking around. Leaning over him and looking over his shoulder, feeling them in his space. You know when someone stands next to you, and there being nothing there. Seeing this giant petrified was quite funny in all honesty, but also very strange. This brings us to present day. Yesterday, I was going to go with my mom to go shopping. I thought her car had started, so I ran into the spare room to look out the window in the driveway to see her car, and she hadn't. I shrugged it off and kept looking out for a couple seconds, when I heard shuffling and breathing behind me. I spun around, and on the other side of the double bed was a kid. A young boy, maybe about 6. He was staring at me. He was pale, dark-haired, and dirty. He looked sick, malnourished. He didn't feel scary or mean. He just felt sad, and the room was freezing. I would have thought that he was a real kid if he didn't look so out of place. We looked at each other for what felt like a lifetime, but was really only about 3 seconds. And I sprinted out of the room and yelled for my mom. I relayed the story to my parents, and they were horrified. My dad went to look and saw nothing. My mom went upstairs and said there was the same thick, heavy air throughout the whole upstairs area. It's almost like a portal opens up and the house feels so unnaturally wrong and hostile. It's unlike anything I've ever felt before in my life. Seeing it was easily the most scared that I've ever been. It reminds me of when my neighbors said that they had heard children. I'm an atheist, but I slept with a crucifix next to me last night. not taking any chances. This is a completely true story. There was one time about 2 or 3 years ago. I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there around 4 p.m. to set up and all. Once we had settled in, we got a fire going. I told my brother I was going to go get some firewood because we only had enough to get it started. So I went out, and it was around 7 p.m. Then I got really cold all of a sudden, even though the weather was not cold at all. When I got the sudden rush of coldness, I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil, hatred, and despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me it was fine, that it was probably just a strong wind that had given me a chill. But I knew that something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was watching me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of evil, but this time faintly. It slowly started getting worse and worse, almost as if it were growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went back to bed. At around 2:20ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother in a panic and told him what had happened. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and my arm wasn't even cut, even though I was looking right at it and it was obviously slashed open and bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing had happened to me and that I was just pranking him. At that moment, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard the scream again, but it didn't sound like how a human would scream. It was more of a screech, as if there were an animal or some creature in the distance that was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he had heard it, and he asked me, "What do you mean did I hear that? There was nothing." At that point, I was afraid for my life. I was praying that nothing else would happen. But after a few minutes, I heard the scream again. Every time I heard it, I would feel that dread, that evil again, and my arm would start to have a burning sensation. Eventually, all of it stopped, although after that, I wasn't able to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my brother that I wanted to leave ASAP. When we went to get into the truck, I could have sworn out of the corner of my eye that I saw something run through the woods. I looked to the right while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the trees, maybe higher. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't even think about it anymore. I just got into the truck, and we left. To this day, I still haven't gone camping again. So I found this old, abandoned, broken-down house in the woods close to where I live. I've only lived here about a year. I was alone walking around it, trying to see if I could have a peek inside. While I was walking around and whatnot, I felt a bit scared, but I pressed on. I found a way in, but it smelled so much of mold that I just decided not to bother. Anyway, the point of the story. When I was about to leave, I felt this sensation of sadness wash over me. I stopped and turned around and looked at an open window of the house from about 10 meters away, and I swear that there was a woman who stood there being in pain from the state of her house. I stared and was almost about to cry for a few moments as I walked away, but then I stopped and looked back again. I almost felt drawn to the house, not wanting to leave, but as soon as I got away from it and was walking back home through the forest, the feeling of sadness left. On a side note, the day before I had walked through a part of the forest where a lot of trees had been cut down and a lot of branches and bark were scattered all over the ground. There I also felt such sadness, as if the trees themselves were crying. As I'm writing this, I realize that I sound kind of insane, but I have never really felt this way before, and I feel normal like one day later, like today. When I was 14, I went camping in the summer with the Girl Guides. We only traveled a few miles away to a place that we had visited a few times for game nights. Each year our guides would merge with the two others in the area for a huge campout that lasted about 5 days. The place we were staying in was rumored to have a ghost in the main house. The story says that it only shows itself to members of the family. We were staying on the large estate near the woods, right away from the house. I had been there quite a lot, and knew the grounds pretty well, which was awesome. I was staying in a tent with the younger girls. They were aged 10 to 13, because I didn't have my own tent like the other older girls. The first night went by smoothly. We built a climbing frame, lit candles in the dark, and pretended that we had landed on an alien planet. It was a silly, fun game. The next morning, me and one of the other girls get up early. Our group job was to collect firewood for breakfast, so we ventured into the woods on our own. We were joking around, grabbing sticks and stuff as we walked along. We ended up at the obstacle course and decided to play on it for a while, even though it was out of bounds. When we were done, we grabbed the firewood and started walking back to camp. The woods, to me, they felt and looked strange. It was as if the place was slightly different. I decided to start trying to scare the girl that I was with, just messing around, trying to spook her because it was funny to me. She got really scared and ran off and left me behind. I wasn't bothered as I slowly walked back. That was when I saw movement to my left, and then again up ahead. As I was about to leave the woods, I saw a man out of the corner of my eye. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, carrying something long. I think it was a shotgun. There was no one there. I just shrug it off. Stuff like that doesn't bother me. I've seen strangers out in the woods before. Once out of the forest, everything goes back to normal. I looked back and the woods were as they should have been. Not like they were moments ago. I don't know how to explain it. They just seemed newer for a while. Not as wild, I guess. But everything was kind of grainy, misty, except that there was no mist. So I don't think anything of it. I enjoy the campout, we play games, sing songs, and just have a good time. On the second to last day, we play the game. We landed on the alien planet, and once we had breakfast, we had to go hide in the woods, build a shelter, a fire to make food, and people had to go steal food from the campsite without being seen. I am left in the woods on my own for ages as the other girls go around gathering the food. I built a pretty awesome shelter, but I realized I needed my penknife, which I had left in my tent, so I went to go get it. I get to the tent to find the kids that I was sharing it with, crying their eyes out, terrified. Eventually I get the story out of them. They had been making their food when a man, wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, had appeared and then vanished in front of them where I had seen him. I assured the kids that it was fine, and that it couldn't hurt them, and they eventually went back into the woods, but they were obviously very shaken. I got the blame for telling them a scary story, but I had only tried to scare that one girl at the very start and hadn't mentioned anything about the man to anyone. That night was the campfire. As it ended, we all ran through the pitch-black woods back to camp, leaving the person looking after us all alone in the forest. She had a light, so it was no big deal. She had to make sure that the fire was out as well. I found out a week after that she had been horrified walking back to camp and refused to go back into the woods again after that. She has refused to camp at that site ever since, but she won't tell us what she saw. The last day, I got bored while packing everything up. After all that had happened, I was in a ghost hunting mood, so me and two of the other girls go into the trees. I'm in the lead, and I'm walking along a path. I stopped and heard footsteps in front of us. Clear footsteps, walking on dead leaves, but no one was there. No one was anywhere near us. I followed the sounds along a path. Someone had heavy boots on. It was so bizarre. We all had trainers on. The girls I was with were silent. They could hear it as well. I followed the sounds around to a clearing at the very edge of the woods, where it stopped. I decided to sit down in the grass. The others followed me, but they sat behind me because they were scared at this point. I do the whole, "If anyone is there, could you give me a sign?" routine. As I finished, a white mist suddenly fell over the woods. You could see things moving behind it, though nothing was clear. It hung in the air as the other two girls ran off screaming. I sat for a minute and watched before saying thank you. As I said this, it was as if a gust of wind hit, and it disappeared. There was no wind. It was just amazing. That was the last of the strange stuff for that camping trip. We had to finish packing up and left the camp that afternoon. I've been back a few times since, and nothing else strange has happened. The woods have always felt normal. A few years after that, I found out that I'm actually related to the family who owned the house and estate. I'm always curious if the activity picked up because I was staying on the grounds. There was one time I was staying at a hotel in Madrid, not too far from the airport, and by the time my buddy and I arrived there, it was 11 p.m. I had completely messed up the booking information because I forgot that we were losing a day by traveling from California. Since my buddy and I had arrived to the hotel so late, we were exhausted. Still, we were given our room number, a card, and sent up to our room. I noticed that the more turns we made down a hallway, the less lights worked. By the time we reached our room door, it was dark and scary. I didn't want to say anything, implying that I was feeling uneasy about the room because I was 24 at the time, so I had to be tough, and my buddy was 27. Once we opened the door, the room was bright and looked very modern. I felt a whole lot better upon entry. The room was supposed to have 2 full-size beds, but for some reason they were pushed together to make a giant bed. My buddy and I agreed it wasn't a big deal, just to stay on our sides of it and deal with it until tomorrow when we weren't so tired. I slept on the left, and he slept on the right. Sometime between 1 and 4 a.m., when it was very dark in the room, I woke up and saw a man standing in the corner. I knew for sure that the man wasn't my friend. My buddy Cody is 6'2", 195 pounds. The guy standing in the corner looked about 5'10", 180. This was the first and only time I ever experienced sleep paralysis. I remember staring at the guy, who appeared to have his back to me, facing the corner of the room closest to me, as if he was counting for a game of hide and seek. I stared at my arm hanging off the bed to the left, and focused all of my energy and strength to move it, but I could not. I tried to scream for Cody to wake up so that at least he would know of the man in our room, but no sound would come out of my mouth. I've never panicked so hard in my life, and before I knew it, my eyes closed, and I was unconscious again. It wasn't until 7:30 a.m. that I woke up and screamed Cody's name and hit him. It was as if everything I tried to do during the night suddenly came out all at once. He woke up startled, of course, as I came to the realization that everything was okay. The order of everything I'm about to say next is how I knew that there was a ghost in that room. I told Cody, "Dude, I just freaked out. It's just that last night," and before I was able to finish my sentence, Cody said, "Did you see that guy in the corner?" My jaw dropped as he told me he experienced the exact same thing as I had the night before. He had sleep paralysis and couldn't move as he stared at that man. We had all of our belongings still, and nothing was changed about the room. It still scares me when I think about it until this day. How we could never explain what happened that night, or how we both experienced the same thing. Cody ended up experiencing another ghost in a hostel that we stayed at one time. But as for me, that was the only ghost experience I ever had while traveling. We have a house in the desert of Nevada that we think is haunted. I would often hear people calling my name clear as day from somewhere in the home, but later I would find out that there was no one there. These voices take the shape of one of my family members, like my sister, mother, father, or sometimes a child that I don't recognize. I never really paid attention to it because it was happening like twice a week. I got used to it, but like last week, I was vacuuming the house and I got to the end of the hall where my room is. I see my dog in my room and I just smile at her and she goes back to sleep. But when I turn around, I saw my dog again behind me. My dog never went past me, so there's no way that she could have gotten there without me noticing. I looked back in the room and see a child's head peeking out of my closet. I was so terrified that I ran out of the house and took a hotel for the night. I still don't know if it's a demon or a ghost or something else. The demon child or whatever it is didn't actually look like a child. It was almost like I just knew it was a child when I saw it. It's hard to explain. It has no nose and it was bald with the eyes of a reptile. I can't quite explain any more details because I ran out of there so quickly. I'm in the process of moving out right now, and some even more strange and horrific things have occurred. I would have the most horrible dreams at this house, and this house only, for example. I have dreams of an abandoned warehouse, with a dead, decapitated baby head with a spine still attached, floating around and screaming while chasing me. I would also get severe sleep paralysis. There was a black, demon-like entity that looked like a snake that would climb walls and ceilings. Sleep paralysis has never happened to me before I moved here. I don't know if dreams can be linked to ghosts or demons. I would also see a shadow man lurking around my house from time to time. I thought it was my imagination. I wish it was. I would also hear something running down my hallway. And I would see a dog-like creature outside of my house. But it didn't really look like a dog. It was like 5 or 6 feet tall with long, jagged teeth and just roaming around outside. I thought I was going crazy, or that my eyes must have been playing tricks on me, but I really don't know. Whatever the thing is, I think it can take the shape of anything. It's probably not a ghost. Probably a demon or an alien or a cryptid that can shapeshift. Like I said, I really don't know. I need your help to figure out what it might could be. I will be moving out soon, and I'm not staying in the house anymore. I absolutely hate that place. I recently went bush camping with my boyfriend on Crown Land near Stone Mills, Ontario. It was our first time doing bush camping, so I sent a video of our campsite set up to a friend. Days after this happened, I talked to my friend, who asked me about the ghost in the video that I was completely unaware of since I didn't take a second look at it after sending. When I had that closer look, I zoomed in to see a terrifying skeleton-like figure. At first, I thought it was a glare on the lens from the fire, but the figure is moving way quicker than the speed of the camera. This place was very deserted, but throughout the night, I heard clear footsteps that sounded human. So much so that I thought that the cops had come to kick us out when I saw a flashlight point at us from the woods. I quickly pointed my light back, but never saw any animals or people. I have been camping a lot and have had deer, squirrels, and raccoons come to my campsite, and their footsteps did not sound like the ones that I had heard. I'm not a believer of the paranormal or anything of the sort, so I didn't even think about it until watching the actual footage. This took place in 2012 when I went to Rome for a vacation with my family for about 3 weeks. It was a week before I had to go back home, so my dad wanted us to visit the town that he was from, so his cousin drove us to the house that he owned. To give everyone some backstory, it belonged to a duke back in the day. But anyway, we got there and nothing seemed odd at all, except that when his cousin showed us where I and my grandmother would be sleeping, because there were not enough rooms and beds. I and my mom had to share a room with 2 single beds, and my dad slept with his cousin. As soon as I walked into this room, something felt off, because it was icy cold, freezing cold, and it felt like I was being watched. Even my mother felt the same thing, that something was weird about that room, because the other rooms in the house did not have that same energy. I even told my father that something didn't feel right, that I didn't want to stay there, that I wanted to leave, that I got a bad feeling being in that room. It was like my gut was telling me that something was there that was not supposed to be. However, it was enough to freak me out and just give me a bad feeling. The day progressed, and it was nighttime, and walking back in that room, I got really bad vibes, and I told my mother that I didn't want to stay there, that something just wasn't right, that I could feel it. She said, "Well, look, it's only for a night." As we got ready to head to sleep, she went toward the bed, and all of a sudden the bed fell, and it was almost as if someone had pushed it. It really scared me. It somehow landed near the fireplace in the room. As my mom called out to my dad and his cousin, they fixed the bed. I was freaked out, to say the least. Anyways, at that moment, me and my mother just prayed to help us get through the night and protect us from whatever was in there. I did not sleep well, and as soon as the morning came, I was ready to nope out. I took a picture of the bed with my camera, and after looking at it, you could see a black shadow near the fireplace hovering over the bed, and it was super creepy. Me and some friends went to an abandoned mental asylum at night, not really expecting much. We busted in through one of the boarded up windows, and when we were inside, we all heard talking. We figured that other people were there, so we followed the sound. We were walking down the hall and heard a woman whispering, "Why did you take my baby?" over and over again. At this point, I was visibly shaking, and we all believed we found where the sound was coming from originally. We go to this room, and there was a huge cage. It looked like one of those pet carriers, only human-sized. I don't know what actually happened that night. I don't really believe that dead people were talking in there, but the sheer creepiness of it all was just too much. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running along next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire, started on dinner over the fire before it got dark, and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic would set in if it even began to die down. I couldn't relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all of my stuff there. I got out to the parking lot about 1.5 miles away and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but couldn't step past the tree line. I waited all the way until morning to go back to get my stuff, and the feeling was gone. I got everything together and left. Haven't been back since. I don't know if it was a ghost or a native spirit, since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. This memory still haunts me to this day. I was staying at an old hotel by the beach when I was around 8 or 9. It had a reputation for being an extremely haunted location around the eastern coast of Florida. The hotel I'm referring to is the Plaza, a 100-year-old hotel on the coastline. At one point, I went down to the lobby to get some utensils for room service. There was a clear door leading to the closed bar area. You were basically looking at the end of the serving counter when you peered in, with chairs on the side and a small beer keg at the end. It was very dark inside the room, and since the door was locked, I could only peek in through the glass. I inspected the room for about 10 seconds. Suddenly, I was looking at one of the chairs. It had a giant dent on the right rear leg. Then, suddenly, it flew backward and toppled over. I was so scared that I fell to the ground, and as soon as I landed, I heard what sounded like a woman screaming from the floor above, or possibly the second floor, as this was on the ground floor. It was quite possibly the strangest and most terrifying scream I have ever heard. It lasted about 4 seconds, and sounded like an old woman mixed with a lion, kind of. Again, this was around the time when I was 8 or 9, and seeing as how I am now 23, the memory has become slightly vague. I was in Pennsylvania exploring an abandoned mill/factory that had been built in the 1800s, at dusk. I was standing on a pile of limestone cinder blocks surrounded by tall grass and brush, with a tree line about 1 acre away, just after the sun had set while my friends were inside still. As I was climbing down, I heard a low, guttural growl. Not like a dog's growl, or any type of animal for that matter. It was deep. It had much more bass to it. It was very disturbing and not like anything I have ever heard before. It sounded as if it were very close, but I didn't hear any brush moving. It freaked me out, and I booked it to my friend's house in the dark.